Welcome to the Computational Medicine Podcast, where we discuss AI and computational tools being deployed in medicine. I'm Alex, a doctor working in London. Today we're talking to Dr. Hugh Harvey. He's Managing Director at Hardian Health, a healthcare consultancy that provides clinical research and medical affairs support to AI or health tech products. Previously, he was a consultant radiologist and worked at Hardian Health. He was also editor of Nature Digital. We discussed regulation of AI as a medical device, where he sees AI being deployed in medicine effectively in the next few years, and the main pitfalls for companies and public bodies trying to deploy AI in medicine. This was a great conversation, and we really got into the core of what to expect from these new technologies. AI is going to revolutionise medicine, but safeguarding its deployment to ensure that it's done safely is as important as developing the new technology. Dr. Harvey really cut through a lot of the hype around these new AI tools and showed us what the likely benefits are going to be from these new technologies in the next few years. Right, so thank you very much, Dr. Harvey, for agreeing to come onto the podcast. So just to start off, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you started working in the overlap between medicine and AI?
Thanks. Yeah, and Alex, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on. How did I get into AI? I'm not really sure I'm actually fully in AI, but let me explain. So yeah, I was a consultant radiologist and got to the top of the ladder and went into academia. So after I did my CCT in radiology, I did 2 years doing an MD research degree. I was doing MRI of the prostate, and part of that thesis was looking at machine learning derived segmentation of prostate tissue for various reasons. And this was about 2014. So just a couple of years after deep learning had really become, or just appeared on the map, really. And then after I'd done that for about 2 years, I sort of felt that there was going to be this wave of technologies being applied to radiology using these deep learning techniques. So I really wanted to sort of be part of that. And I tried to get a job outside of medicine in AI, because obviously you can't get one within the NHS, or you couldn't back in 2014 anyway. And I joined a company called Hardian Health, which many people have heard of, which has since, it's controversial how it's done, but some people say it's done very well, some people say it's done very badly. I was there for a year, helping out with the clinical team, helping them with their AI model. And the MHRA knocked on the door one day and said, "You're building a medical device." No one had heard of this concept before. And I was asked to take the meeting, and the rest was history. I sort of got chucked into medical device regulation and spent many months back and forth with the MHRA, who are the UK regulators of software as a medical device. I was there for a year, and then did a stint back in the NHS as a locum consultant at Guy's and Tommy's, and then joined another startup called Chiron Medical, which was focusing on breast cancer screening using AI. Worked there for 2.5 years, and we got the UK's first CE marked. So that's the first regulatory cleared deep learning device for decision support for breast screening. So that was a really fantastic achievement. And I worked alongside the AI team there. So my foray into AI has never been me building it. It's been me working with it in a clinical and regulatory capacity. And then since 2018, I've just been consulting as an independent. I started my own limited company to offer my services just as myself originally, but now we have a team of 20, and we service clients from around the world who are all trying to bring AI as a medical device into the market, whether that's within the UK or over the pond in America or in Europe. So it's been a fascinating journey. I never planned it. If you'd asked me back in 2014 where I'd end up, it certainly wouldn't be here. So no, it's been very exciting.
Fantastic. And could you just tell us a bit more about the work that Hardian Health does?
Sure. So we are basically a consultancy purely focused on software as a medical device, which is the legal term for such products. And we originally started with sort of two verticals, as we call it, which was obviously the regulatory side of things, but also the clinical. So if you're going to bring an AI device to market, you need clinical evidence, not only for your regulatory submissions, but also for your customers who want to see that it works as you say. And in medicine, we have quite a high evidence bar. So having come from that academic background and run clinical trials and investigations during my research time, I had an understanding of how that landscape looked. And then so Hardian does those two, clinical and regulatory, but we've since also been drowning in requests for helping people generate health economics evidence. So this is modeling out what it looks like in a care pathway with AI, with all of the costs associated and where the cost savings are. We also do go-to-market strategy. So we have two excellent, long-in-the-tooth consultants from GE actually, who've launched multiple products onto market, and they help startups with their strategy on how to approach the market. And we do a bit of intellectual property work as well. Many startups have to defend themselves with a moat of intellectual property in order to have sort of freedom to operate within the market. So it's been a very interesting experience learning alongside some of the experts that we've managed to bring on board our team.
Fantastic. And how do you see AI and machine learning impacting the future of healthcare, particularly in the field of medical imaging and diagnostics?
So if we look at healthcare as a totality, AI can probably help with anything that is currently digitized, because obviously it needs digital input. And that largely comes in the form of imaging. If you look at a hospital, the one department that is creating the most amount of data is the radiology department. MRI scans are gigabytes upwards, and there's no other department that produces that amount of data. And that holds true when we now look at the market. We're about 5-6 years into this sort of post-AI opportunism, and there's over 500 FDA cleared, so that's the American regulatory approval process. There's about 500 devices cleared, probably more now, and about 90% of them, I think, are radiology AI devices. So wherever you have a substrate of digital data with a ground truth, and we can come on to what exactly that means later, then there's an opportunity to build some machine learning pipeline. So at Hardian, we're seeing, obviously, the early wave of AI was focused on medical imaging. That is now transposing into digital pathology, which is becoming more and more digitized, with separate and unique challenges because the data is even larger in digital pathology. We're seeing it in cardiology, especially with cardiac echo, ECG analysis, and wearables. And then we're starting to see it in mental health, which bucks the trend a little bit. But we're seeing lots of apps claiming to use AI, helping people with things like ongoing therapy and finding trigger events for certain mental health illnesses. So these are kind of the four main aspects that we're seeing. We're not seeing it so much in the non-data driven specialities such as surgery. Although there are companies in this space, they are few and far between. Or even general medicine, the rheumatologies and the endocrinologies, we're not seeing much AI being used in those situations. So yeah, it's mainly the image-based specialities, the ones that are rich in data, and the ones where it's possible to have a ground truth.
Well, I think that's fantastic lead into just a short summary of what ground truths are.
So yeah, I mean, it depends on who you ask, but you're a doctor. You know that medicine isn't black and white. It's shades of grey. Sorry for the radiology reference there, but it's true. No two patients are the same. If you ask the same clinical question to 100 doctors, you won't get the same answer from everybody. There is no ultimate truth in medicine. Well, there may be, but it eludes modern medicine anyway. So
some specialties are clearer than others.
Absolutely. And it's arguable that radiology is one of the only specialties that writes down their opinions on a regular basis, at least. So a ground truth is essentially when you're trying to learn from unlabeled data using an AI system, it can pick out signal in that data, but it needs to be picking out the correct signals. Because if you're building a model, you want it to be able to produce outputs that make sense in the real world. And while these deep learning networks are really good at picking up signal from within noisy data sets, they do need some guidance. And I'm not talking about the modern AIs like the large language models, I'm talking about the deep learning neural networks. They need to be ground truthed. So what is a ground truth? Well, in essence, it's an agreed expert consensus of what the classification outcome is of a certain data point. So it could be looking at a CT scan, is there a stroke? Yes or no. It could be looking at a chest x-ray, is there pneumonia? Yes or no. But it goes far deeper than that as well, because as you know, strokes aren't just strokes, pneumonia is not just pneumonia, there's multiple substratifications and different possible presentations of it. So ground truthing is the process of collating as much expertly labeled data as possible in order to train that neural network to be able to perform at the level of those experts. Which is why it's difficult in medicine, because medical images, even though they come with a report from a radiologist, don't necessarily come with a ground truth. That radiologist could be wrong. They could have slightly misdescribed things, or they haven't described everything in full, because radiologists don't tell you about every single little pixel on the image. So a ground truth process is more comprehensive than the standard clinical data that you might extract from a hospital. So companies will spend millions trying to label data and gather labeled data. And for a while, people were saying, data is the new oil, and I always disagreed and thought labeled data is the new oil. But there we go.
Yeah, at least in our field, yes, absolutely. I mean, I've heard a lot of, for example, one of Eric Topol's, I think, his PhD students who runs the Dr. Penguin regular email chain that is full of the sort of top medical AI papers published each week. I think that it may have been him that I heard mention that, or maybe it was Andrew Nung, that there's a big push for, say, top quality, publicly available data sets. So well labeled data sets. And I think that there's currently a big push. I think it might be from Harvard to get, and this is all types of medical data, say bioinformatics, as well as clinical data, as well as imaging. But I just wondered what your thoughts are on those kind of efforts.
Well, it's true. We do need more labeled data. And we can't do what we generally see on the internet, which is ask the general public to help label the data. Every time you go onto a website where there's some sort of security login, you might be asked to do a captcha. So is there a street sign or a car or a bicycle? That's you labeling data for an AI. That's all you're doing. For free, by the way. And we don't have that in medicine. We don't have armies of people. Now, there are kind of three main ways that people try and get around that. One is sort of a mechanical Turk process where they try and train people to ask them to answer very simple yes/no questions about an image, and they might not necessarily need to be medically trained to provide a good consensus answer. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is to pay experts to label data according to a very strict labeling protocol and criteria. And I've certainly known hundreds of radiologists around the world who spent hours drawing around lesions on medical images. And then the third way is to try and link it with downstream medical information. So could you link a chest x-ray with the downstream biochemistry lab reports or the biopsy results or the ultimate patient outcome? And that is probably the way to go, but it comes with many, many hurdles. First of all is data access. And second is, medicine just isn't set up to record data like that. We don't record data for the purpose of labeling it. We record data for the purpose of documentation of the patient record for humans to understand what is going on with that patient. So, and also it doesn't come in any unique single format, unlike medical imaging, which has come in the DICOM format for over 30 years now. So there are different ways and methods. My belief is that probably a combination of all three is best and adequate. But in an ideal world, we would be collecting data live within a hospital in a machine-readable, universal harmonized standard that follows the patient on in perpetuity. But that's a pipe dream currently.
Hopefully not for long. Fantastic.
We'll find out in the near future, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've heard you mention in a previous podcast that less than 1% of medical academic medical AI papers actually get deployed and end up interacting with the patient. So my question is, what do you think needs to be done to increase that number, or do we even want to increase that number?
It's a good question. It's the Jurassic Park question. We're so concerned about wondering whether we can. We're not stopping to think about whether we should. While AI certainly is a powerful tool, not all tools are right for the job. And you have to think about it in an economically viable way. Is there actually a business case? If I spend £1 million training in AI and £250,000 getting regulatory approval and £500,000 on marketing and sales, am I going to make £2 million back by selling this to a hospital to provide quite a limited input into that care pathway, just giving a risk classification or a diagnostic decision support? That's the first thing, is should we? So let's assume that we've found some pain points where we think AI is the only tool that can do this. Then the question is, can we? And certainly we can, with the right data and the right attitude. But then you come across all of the barriers to market entry that I sort of work in, the dirty work, as I call it. You'll need to document your development in the software development lifecycle. You need to verify and validate it. You need to do clinical investigations. You need to write a clinical evaluation report. You need to apply for an audit with the regulators. And then you need to have post-market surveillance and follow-up. So there's a whole burden of work beyond just building the tool that gets lost in a lot of the hype and noise around AI. And I saw a brilliant thing a few months back on Twitter. Someone's an airline pilot, and he said, look, if someone invented a new jet engine tomorrow, we wouldn't see it on airplanes for 10 years because it has to undergo all of the safety testing and stress testing and integration and training and all sorts of things before you can use it safely in an airplane. The same goes with any new technology in medicine. Is you just can't invent something new and just use it straight away on real life patients. It's not ethical and it's not moral. And we have a duty of care to do no harm. And while AI itself can cause harm to patients at a relatively low level, at an individual patient level, it's the scale that's unprecedented. When you invent a new cancer drug, you might be giving it to 10,000 people a year. When you invent an AI, you might be using it to scan 50 million people a year. So even though the harm per patient is low, the population level harm is incredibly vast. And I don't think we're quite prepared for that.
So, so how do you think large language models like ChatGPT should be regulated in healthcare?
Well, again, I'll start with the first question is, do we need to use ChatGPT in healthcare? Is there an economically viable business case? I gather that OpenAI have spent upwards of $1 billion training this thing. So are they going to make $1 billion back by giving it to medicine? That's the first question to answer. Let's assume that they can make money from it somehow. In its current form, it is extremely dangerous to use in medicine. Extremely. And I'd say that in no uncertain terms. Anybody who's used it for more than a couple of minutes will very quickly realize it is incorrect a lot of the time, but dangerously plausibly incorrect. You can ask it things and it will come back with what it thinks sounds like a good answer, and at first glance may read like a sensible answer, and certainly the quality of the English response is very high, but the factual content and the correctness of that is dubious at best and can really miss the mark entirely. And there's some very famous public cases outside of medicine of it, saying that someone had been arrested for sexual abuse of a teenager or something like that. And I'm just like, if there's a model that's just making stuff up like that, it's just not fit for purpose in medicine. Someone tried to use it to, they put some patient notes in from the emergency room from a young woman who came in with lower abdominal pain, and it completely missed to ask about an ectopic pregnancy, which should be top of mind whenever you see someone of fertile age coming with lower abdominal pain. it's incredibly dangerous to be using it. And I would warn any doctors who are actually using it without their hospital knowing that they're using it, be careful. Be very careful. It's not licensed for that use, and it's quite clearly labelled. This makes mistakes. So that's my first point. Is please don't really think about using it in its current form. So we got asked at Hardian a lot. Surely we can get this regulatory approved, and the sad answer is no, not in its current form. As I said, it's dangerous. And the main reason is because there's no way of verifying or validating the software as it currently stands. It's privately owned. Its training data set is not publicly disclosed. There's been no external documentation as to how it is quality assured. And all of these things you have to show the regulators when you submit for regulatory approval. So it's currently impossible to use ChatGPT via an API in a medical device. So what we wrote in our blog was, well, let's assume that someone does build a large language model with all of the appropriate documentation and quality assurance. And that's a big if, but could happen. Then how would you use that in medicine? And you still have a lot of hurdles to overcome. And the first hurdle is, how do you ensure factual content? So one way we propose is that you somehow hook it up to some validated medical database where you've got the entirety of medical knowledge somehow correctly stored in a machine readable form, which in itself is a massive hurdle. And then how do you actually clinically validate it? You'd have to run the mother of all clinical investigations, because you have a system where you can put infinite different inputs in and receive infinite different outputs. So how on earth do you test that in some kind of solid, academically robust clinical investigation? The mind almost boggles. And then there's the issue of the post-market surveillance. So I did mention briefly earlier that once you're on market, you need to monitor the performance of your device for the lifetime that your device is on market. So how do you monitor, let's say 100 hospitals are using your large language model. How do you monitor for accuracy for each and every single input and output that you're getting? It's almost impossible to do so. You'd have to figure out a way of subsampling at a statistically powered level. So there's many hurdles to be had, and I'm not sure that there's an economic or business case that's viable unless you can demonstrate you're saving significant amounts of money or improving patient care to the point where it's really financially worth it.
Yeah, I mean it's closed source. We don't know how it works. We don't know what we don't know. Previous iterations of the GPTs were open source. But yeah, deploy. Yeah, I think that what you just described is, say, what needs to be done to get anything that's even remotely related to a large language model being used effectively and sustainably, and to make a good business case for being used in medicine. If I had to twist your arm and get you to put a rough estimation on when you think something like that might actually be used effectively in a medical setting, when would you hedge your bets?
I'd probably buffer it. I'd say 5 to 15 years. And I say 5 because I remember when deep learning first became popular, sort of 2012 to 2014. And that's when Geoffrey Hinton said radiologists will be out of a job in 5 years. We're now in 2023. Not a single radiologist has lost their job, but some are using AI. But only some. It's not ubiquitous or widespread by any means. And earlier you said, the regulations haven't caught up with the advancements in technology. That's true in all sectors. You can't regulate for things that have not been invented yet. If someone invented a teleportation device where you could get in London and appear in New York a split second later, there'd be no regulation for that. You just have to come up with new regulatory frameworks, and this is how we move forward. And it has to be at a slow, controlled pace. We're in a massive macroeconomic tech bubble at the moment, partly driven by the pandemic, partly driven by Silicon Valley, and everyone just needs to slow down just a little bit. We will get there, but the world's not ready, and the regulators they're the good guys. I really dislike it when people say the regulators are the bad guys and they're slowing down innovation.
I've
The
definitely
regulators,
not heard that. I've
I
definitely
have,
not heard any of this.
I hear it all the time, and I'm like, well, the
What?
regulators are the police.
Obscene.
The regulators are just the police, right? And
The
the police are only the bad guys if you're a criminal.
I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it's going to be a human's. When you come in as when you get admitted to hospital, for example, you're going to have until there's this sort of post artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence utopia that everyone's talking about. It's going to be a human consultant's name under your that's looking after you and solely responsible for you. And if I were looking after a patient, and it was and I was the consultant looking after a patient, I would want nothing but the most scrutinized regulation to be making sure that anything that was helping me to do that job was doing it safely and effectively. Because if these things make a mistake at any one point in the way, it is a human consultant that has provided that service at the end of the day. They're only ever supplementing human delivery of care up until we get to this sort of techno utopia, which is an entirely different conversation.
Yeah. The other thing to remember with ChatGPT is that currently, as it works, is you can give it a scenario or some data or some text and ask it to do something with that data, and it will give you a response. It can't currently search the internet, though I'm aware that there's Bard, which is connected up to the internet in a different format. But currently, it can't perform search of live data, and it can't interact with real time with data. It requires a large corpus of historic training data, and that's not really fit for medicine either, because your differential diagnosis of a patient may change based on just one blood result that comes back out of a huge panel that you order from emergency. And then the next part is that really is a text interface really the best way? I mean, do doctors need to sit there and type in, what is the differential diagnosis for, and then write out a whole vignette about their patient? Patients don't arrive with a neatly written vignette to a hospital or a GP. Their stories are multi-layered. You often have to get beyond the presenting complaint to the truth of the matter. We see this in radiology the whole time, where people get sent down for scans for one reason, but actually you find something else on the imaging. And it's the unpredictability of the human body and medicine that really makes it quite difficult to put it in a purely data-driven environment. So I agree with you. Medicine is always going to have to be human-led. I mean, even if you look at science fiction, if you watch Star Trek, I don't know if you watched it when you were a kid, but I certainly did. They're like massively in the future, and they've got the tricorder, or whatever it's called, which they can wave over someone to tell them what's wrong. They've still got doctors. So it's not all just completely AI driven. So I think yeah, it's an exciting future if we do it right, but it's going to come slower than people think, and it's just got to be done properly. And it's got to pass what I call the grandmother test. Would you want it used on your grandmother? Or if you've got kids, would you want it used on your child? That's a really important question to stop and think.
Absolutely. I love it, cutting through all the hype to the legitimate stuff that actually gets used and has good quality evidence behind it, which is what you need. Okay, so I've also heard you mention previously how when you're advising, say, a medical startup that uses AI, they should be thinking about regulation from day one. I can imagine that some startups get blindsided on the way to a minimum viable product, that they might think that that's a priority over regulation. So my question is, my question is, how do you think? Do you think that's the main reason that startups are not prioritizing regulation early on, or is there something else to it?
Well, startups who don't prioritize regulation will hit the brick wall of being unable to sell to a hospital or healthcare system, because regulatory approval is the minimum barrier to entry to the market. And it's been a really fascinating journey to see the awareness of medical device regulation massively grow. No one was talking about it a decade ago because medical devices were just hardware. It was a surgical scalpel or a hip replacement or something like that. And suddenly it's become software, which anybody can build from their bedroom. And the regulation has always been sort of under the hood, as you might call it. The other thing is that I'm not always convinced that a startup is the best methodology for getting something incredibly complex to market. It's a good way to accelerate ideas, but it very quickly needs to be absorbed into a larger entity with that legal and financial backing, I think, to be able to really make a success of it. Now, I'm not saying that startups can't make it, some have, but it's a risky market. 90% of startups fail. That's just fact. And you know, I've already seen in the radiology market a massive consolidation. So back at one of the big American conferences, maybe 5 years ago, there was over 200 startups. And then revisiting it last year, that was narrowly down to about, I don't know, 30 who had actually sort of stayed the course and made it through. And all of them had regulatory approval, obviously, at that stage. So yeah, Sorry, you carry on.
Sorry, no, after you.
No, it's all right. I kind of finished my point there.
Oh, right, okay. Do you think that the quality of those 30 startups that were left at 5 years later, do you think that they had a lot more evidence and robust evidence behind their efficacy?
Yeah, absolutely. So they'd all been involved with pilot studies. They'd all worked with hospitals to collate, label, test, validate, gain the regulatory approval, do their pilot studies, and then move on to commercial deployments. So absolutely. It's kind of like an accelerated pathway to bringing drugs to market. So medics who are listening, or people in the pharmacy industry who are listening, will know that there are 4 phases of pharmacological study. With tech, what we seem to be doing is just slightly speeding that up and kind of skipping phase 3. So people kind of do phase 1, which is, does it kind of work? Yeah, it works on our own sandbox data. Then phase 2, okay, well, let's test it on someone else's data. And then they're getting regulatory approval before they've got real world evidence. And that's just a quirk of the medical device regulation. So I would like to see that made a little bit more robust. And startups won't like to hear this, so cover your ears, but I think we should be demanding pre-market studies for about 2 years before we actually get regulatory approval. Because I've seen a lot of post-market studies and pilot studies fail, and there's a term bandied about in industry called death by pilot, whereby startups are stuck in this death spiral of doing pilots with multiple different sites, and the results just aren't good enough to convert those sites into commercial partners. And a lot of capital and time and effort could have been saved if we'd just done one proper study pre-market in advance. And we just have to be ready to kill the unicorn sometimes. It needs to be slain before it gets off the ground, because then you're seeing these massive companies, they exit, they have a public IPO, and then they collapse and fail because the evidence doesn't really support what they've claimed all along, which is a sad state of affairs.
And I've also heard you mention before that quite often the digital integration in the NHS can be one of the most difficult parts for any company trying to implement either a digital health or a AI software solution. What are the biggest challenges and solutions within that integration problem?
So the technology stack within a hospital is incredibly archaic. And I can give you one example. So when I was working at the breast cancer screening startup, we had to interact with the National Breast Screening Program software, which was written in a programming language, I think from memory, called Crystal, which no one had programmed in since the 70s or 80s. And we had to get an old programmer out of retirement, a lovely old lady, to come along and write us some kind of API so we could access the data. Like, it's incredibly archaic. And you're laughing, but it's 100% true.
I mean, I'm laughing because it just resonates right to the core of my experience day to day. I mean, I've seen Windows 95. I've seen fax machines. I've seen software that is clunkier than Windows 95. That is the main electronic healthcare record system.
It's absolutely true. And like, there's this massive disparity between what you've got on your home computer or your smartphone than what we've got in a hospital. We aren't as advanced as just basic IT.
Well, in America, they've almost all got Epic or Cerner. I mean, and in the UK, like I use Cerner day to day, but the NHS system is not designed to rapidly inject just electronic healthcare records. I don't know what percent of the NHS is for hospital inpatients are documented on paper. My guess would be about more than half, at least 50%. I'd say. I think of hospital inpatients in the NHS is still paper documentation, mixed in with, I don't know, 5 or 6 different types of software that do various bits and bobs when you're on the job. The rationale is that it's safe, so paper documents are known, and everyone, there's no misinterpretation of paper documents. They're they can't be as easily misinterpreted or misused as software can be. But also the system just it's such a behemoth. It's so difficult to I mean, when a CCG is offering out contracts to Cerner or looking at the ways to change. I mean, I worked at a hospital that transitioned from paper notes over to Cerner intelligently on the exact same on the first Wednesday of August, the Wednesday that every single new doctor in the country starts, and it was a complete car crash. I think that they went back to they went back to paper notes. It was just ridiculous. But so just going back to the solutions to these, yes, everything's very archaic, but what are some of the best solutions you've seen to this sort of very archaic, very outdated software that a lot of NHS systems are using? Are you seeing any better solutions over in the US where electronic healthcare records are far more common?
Better solutions? I'm not sure. It's important to remember that the EHRs, the Epics and the Cerners that you mentioned, were never really designed to help doctors record patient notes. They were designed to help hospital administrators record billing episodes. That was the reason that they were adopted, and they've been bastardized and brought over the pond to the NHS, where we literally just do not care how much anything costs for some reason. So ask any doctor how much the blood test they're ordering costs. Literally no one has a clue. I don't think even the hospital knows. And you're right, it can lead to absolute car crashes. My wife is a pharmacist at a big hospital, and they've just installed one of these systems, and everyone has had to pull in late nights and work weekends to get around. And then now back to paper prescribing while something gets sorted. So the whole thing is a complete nightmare. But that said, we need to push for digitization, because as lovely as the old note system was, you lose fidelity of information very quickly. There's only a single source of truth, and if you lose that pile of patient notes, well, you're kind of screwed at that point. And it needs to be better thought out and formulated. There are advances in medical documentation, especially the underlying languages and frameworks. So FIHR or FIRE or FIR, whatever you prefer to call it, is doing the rounds and looking promising. And I think the big EHR systems are trying to rely on that. I always look to radiology, my home comfort territory, the DICOM standard, widely adopted all around the world. Still a completely archaic standard. Many people think that it's harmonized and everyone uses it the same way, but they don't. There's a thing in DICOM standards called private meta tags, where you can attach any information you choose to empty slots in the file memory, and people come up with weird and wonderful things to put in these DICOM meta tags that you would never expect. And so there's a lot of non-standardization across medical data, because it is so almost infinitely complex, the amount of information that we can store about the human body. Coupled with that is actually it's really difficult in any sector to maintain longitudinal records over time. Time is a really odd concept for computing systems to understand. And I've been told one of the hardest computing coding challenges in the world is to write software that can tell you the time in any location around the world on any given date, given all the timelines, the the changes of time at different seasons. Some countries switch from one time zone to another at certain points in history. It's an incredibly difficult thing to manage, and I think even us switching twice a year by 1 hour can confuse things in time zones on EHR systems. And you might be thinking, why is he mentioning time? Well, it's important because in some aspects of medicine, if you have a stroke at midnight on the night that we changed clocks, there's precedent already. I know of cases where things have gone wrong, where people would be delayed by 2-3 hours because the systems didn't catch up. So there's lots and lots and lots of issues. I sound like I'm just a grumpy old man telling you about lots of issues and not offering any solutions. Solutions that work will rise to the top through a foam of solutions that don't quite work. So I'm all for multiple people trying things out, and I'm all for good ideas being tested. All I'm saying is we should do them in a robust way to allow the ones that work to get noticed. Because if we don't do it in a robust way, we risk just uplifting the ones that are hyped more than others, which is not what we want. We want the ones that work. And sometimes the simplest solution just works the best.
Absolutely. And other than regulation or, say, the difficulty with digital integration in the NHS, what are the other most common pitfalls that you see when a company is trying to apply their digital healthcare or AI software to a market?
Two things. One is what I mentioned before, which is the economic viability of something. I think there's a lot of startups who think that they've got a great idea that someone's going to be willing to pay for, but they never sanity check that or do the work to figure out what will people be prepared to pay for it. I saw this a lot in the early days of radiology AI, where they thought, well, we're going to replace radiologists, therefore we'll charge what a radiologist's salary is. And that really doesn't work in terms of health economics. So we do a lot of work now with startups and say, look, let's just figure out the value proposition before you spend millions trying to get this to market. And you do that through a series of proper processes of market research, interviews with all potential stakeholders, and some basic health economic modelling. And if it turns out that it's not a viable business case, then you have to go back to the drawing board. But that, again, is part of getting rid of the froth of hype. And I think that's an important part of the process. It's very rare that you're going to come across an idea, the idea works, and it's valuable straight away. Very, very rare. And the people who've done that have become billionaires. And everyone praises them, but they just got lucky, to be truthful. So, yes, there will be some that make it, and everyone else will go, oh, look, they did it, therefore I can. But luck doesn't always replicate itself. Lightning never strikes twice, and there has to be some kind of proper thinking about it. And what I'm just noticing as a general trend is that what all the hype does is it actually reduces our critical thinking capabilities. And I'm seeing this exceptionally well with all the hype around ChatGPT. Some people who are very well respected are tweeting, oh, ChatGPT is going to replace 300 million jobs. It's just not. It's going to help in some ways, of course, and in ways that we can't currently imagine. But if you think about when the car was first invented, the people said, oh, well, now farriers are going to be out of a job. Yeah, they were. But the automotive industry has created way more jobs than were lost through people in the equine industry. So it will create more jobs eventually, if we can prove it to work.
And looking at, say, digital health or AI solutions that improve structural efficiencies, what are some good examples that you can think of where that's been deployed and it's had a really big impact?
I seriously think, and I do have a bias here, I presume, that breast cancer screening with AI is absolutely the future. And that's for two reasons. One, the only reason you do a mammogram is to answer a yes or no question. Is there cancer, yes or no? Which is really, really what AI is very good at, is classifying things. And two, the current state of practice in the UK is that 2 radiologists read every mammogram. So it makes logical sense that an AI that is very good at classifying this yes or no question could theoretically do the job of one of those two radiologists. And that way you still have human in the loop. You've got an economically viable business model because you are literally saving those man hours of that half of the workforce. So I really think that is probably the best example I can think of AI in medicine at the moment. There's a lot of people saying, oh, we should use ChatGPT to help with diagnosis, but diagnosis is like a really small part of medicine. The bulk of medicine is the treatment. And this is where AI technologies and digital technologies fail completely, because you can't use them to treat physical human beings. You can in some mental health conditions, so you can have digital CBT for depression and anxiety and things, where the mechanism of action is a behavioral change. But where the mechanism of action is something physical or biochemical, then AI just literally can't do anything. So if it's purely going to be in diagnostics, the only two things that you can aim to do are speed up the process of diagnostics or make the process of diagnostics more accurate. But you have to do both significantly better than the current standard of care to have a hope of having an economically viable business case.
And how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the healthcare industry's adoption of AI and machine learning?
I'm not sure it really has. I'm trying to think if there were any AI systems that were adopted because of COVID. And perhaps there were some chest X-ray AI solutions that got a bit closer to procurement because they offered some kind of COVID detection in them. But the COVID pandemic has sort of dissipated almost as quickly as it arrived. Actually, that's not true. It's dissipated slower than it's arrived. But we're still kind of feeling the tailwinds of it. I think what COVID did do is create a massive tech boom because people were stuck at home and the only thing you can do from home is use a computer to interact with the world, and that has created a massive tech boom. And you're seeing that in the macroeconomics of the global market at the moment. So I'm going to answer your question with a negative, I'm afraid. I don't think COVID really had that much of an impact on AI in medicine, other than to maybe focus more eyes and attention on the research aspects of it.
Okay, and can you tell us a bit more about how you found your role as the editor of Nature Digital?
Yeah, so I was invited by Eric Topol, who you mentioned earlier. He was invited by the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt at the time, to come and conduct a review on the NHS of how we can better secure the future of a digital NHS. And there were three streams within the Topol review, and one of them was looking at AI and machine learning. And he handpicked me to come and be the co-chair of that stream of the Topol review. So I worked with Eric and the team over a couple of years, and we produced the big publication that came out, which was basically sort of the prelude to what we're seeing now in terms of better training and education for the staff, more funding going towards AI research, and thinking about better digitization options for the NHS. And then Eric had set up, he actually set up Nature Digital Medicine as a partner journal to Nature. And he asked me to be on the editorial board after that. So I sat on that editorial board for what now? I think 2.5 years, where we saw loads of the early papers coming through. So it was fascinating to be kind of on the other side of academia, having been an academic myself, and being on the editorial board and really build up that community of reviewers who you trusted could understand, this complex mathematics that was being thrown our way. But it became apparent actually that we had to shift from feasibility studies to real world studies quite quickly. People didn't want to read about someone who built an algorithm in their bedroom on a public data set. They wanted to read about someone who built an algorithm and tested it on real world data. And those studies always showed a drop in performance every single time without fail. And then we started to get papers about AI bias and AI drift, and how AI currently, when it's released on market, is a fixed algorithm. It's not supposed to be updated in real time because of safety issues. And so it drifts away, especially if the data substrate that you're operating in changes over time. So for instance, if you're a chest X-ray AI model and you're using GE chest X-ray machines, if GE update their chest X-ray software, then your AI model can drift away from its baseline performance. And then there were hidden biases and substratifications, and AI doing some surprising things. So there was some papers that came out that showed that AI could tell the sex of patients based on their retinal scans and things, which were interesting, but completely medically useless because you can just ask the patient what sex they are. Oh, no, I'm going to get cancelled for saying that. You don't know what sex anyone is these days, do you?
No, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah. But yeah, it can tell you the biological sex of a patient based on their retinal scan, which is fascinating. So AI is finding patterns we didn't know were there, but then how medically useful are they? That's the question. Anyway, so I was editing that for about 2.5 years. And then after a while, my day-to-day job just became too busy. So I stood down. But I still do review for journals when they ask me to. And I still maintain a bit of pen to paper writing and submit papers now and again.
Very good. And could you just give us a short summary of the Topol review for anyone that hasn't heard of it before?
Sure. So it was, as I say, a government commission review, which took about 2 years to really look at the future of healthcare through a digital lens. And it included AI, digital health, robotics, and really was focused on the impacts on the workforce. Like, how is the job market within healthcare going to shift with the advent of digitization? How do we prepare a nationwide workforce like the NHS for the digital revolution when it comes? And so, yeah, a lot of the recommendations were around training. So we created the Topol Fellowships, which are still ongoing. A lot of it was about education, so creating courses and training materials for people to better understand medical devices, medical device regulation, software design processes, and looking at how we can design trials better. So there were a lot of standards were updated. So STARD, which is one of the trial standards that people work to in the UK, was updated with an extension. We updated the consult and spirit extensions for randomized control studies and things like that. So the Topol review was like a good baseline platform. And it's been interesting, actually, going back to read it. We were right about sort of 75 to 80% of the stuff. It's impossible to be right about everything, of course. And it would be interesting to do a kind of 10-year review of it. I guess, when will that be? That'll be
when did it come out?
When did it come out? I think 2019, 2020.
Okay. Yeah. Great idea. How much? How much knowledge or how much computational knowledge do you think that doctors are going to need in the next sort of 50 years?
How much computational knowledge will doctors need in the next 50 years?
As we see, so I can imagine that the answer is probably going to be not much, because the average doctor's job is still to diagnose and treat diseases and communicate with the patients, etc. But yeah, I guess that those who are doing the regulation. So my question is probably more towards the regulation side of things. So it's not great when we have a closed source technology that we don't know how it works in detail. So I'll change my question actually over to the regulators. How much knowledge do you think that the regulators need to have of the way that an artificial intelligence medical technology works? As in, I can imagine it will be everything and anything, and you can't leave any stone unturned in the way that you understand the way that it works.
Yeah, the regulators are quite hot on this, but as you said earlier, they are always behind the cutting edge of technology. You know, as soon as someone invents something, the only person who knows how it works is the inventor. And in cases of ChatGPT, I don't think even they really know exactly how it performs as well as it does.
Yeah, 100%.
What the regulators want to know is, was it developed safely, and has it been validated? And what they mean by that is, given a certain input, is the output correct, and is it deterministic? By which they mean, if you give the same input, will you always get the same output? Or if it's non-deterministic, what's the variation in the accuracy of that output? And that's a very hard thing to measure. In terms of how much computational knowledge do the regulators need, they don't need to be able to build neural networks and configure hyperparameters. That kind of stuff is left to the developers. It's more about the regulatory science of things. And I get a lot of people asking me, oh, should I go into AI? Should I learn how to code neural networks? And I say that you can make just as good a career if not a more fascinating one, studying regulatory science. And in fact, we need to, as you say, push forward the regulatory science at pace as well. So I'm always trying to push people down that career pathway of thinking about how to use cutting edge practice in regulatory science as well, so that we can, hopefully have more streamlined regulatory processes, hopefully have streamlined regulatory processes that allow us to have continually learning AI machine learning models live in clinical practice, which we currently can't do under the current regulatory frameworks. So, and if we ask, about doctors, how much computational knowledge will they need? I would say quite little. I would like to think that you will need about as much computational knowledge as you do to use your iPhone, which is very little. You need to know a bit about where general settings are and things, but in essence, it should just work and fit into your workflow very neatly, almost silently or invisibly. I think if you want to get into the developing side, then that's when you can go as deep down the rabbit hole as you wish.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And do you think you've had any approaches to your career that have helped you along the way?
I mean, I've had things that have helped and have hindered. I am slightly ADHD, and I have a very hyperactive brain, and so I get bored very easily. And so I found sitting in a dark room all day was fascinating for a few years, and I got quickly bored. So I've always tried to design my career to be as flexible as possible. Also, be critical. It's very easy to go along with the bandwagon and the flow, but if you can be critical in a way that offers positive solutions, then you can have a valuable impact on a sector as well. And I think my training in medicine and academia helped me think critically. And I think the other thing is, don't be afraid to ask people for help. There is a tendency for people to think they're going to make it on their own, which is just simply not true. Ask for help. I couldn't have built the business I've built without getting in specialists in each of the particular facets of what we do. I am by no means an expert in any single one of those. I'm sort of overarching, driving the thing forward. Ask people for help. Reach out. The worst anyone can do is say no, which isn't that bad, really, if you think about it. So in terms of career, think critically, ask for help, avoid bandwagons, and don't worry about money. Everyone is so money orientated. If you find something you genuinely love and you're good at, the money will follow.
Fantastic. Great advice. And are there any books that you would recommend?
2. There's a really, really good book. Let me look up on my bookshelf who the author is. Hang on a second. I've got it here. It's called Weapons of Math Destruction.
Kathy something.
Yeah, where is it? It's on my book. I can't see it. It's up there. It's very good. That talks about the risks of harms of AI at scale. Absolutely fascinating. And then a fiction book. I think it should be mandatory reading for anybody in technology. Should be June, the fantasy novel by Frank Herbert. And you might have seen the film that came out a year or so ago. That is set in a futuristic world where AI has been banned. So it's fascinating to dig into the fictional history of why that happened.
Lovely. And last question. So what are your thoughts on AI safety?
I have many.
Outside of medicine.
Outside of medicine, I mean, I think AI safety outside of medicine is going to kind of shine a light on where we need to go in medicine. I think if we're talking about general AI that's just been widely used by the general public, we're going to start to see widespread harms, which at an individual level will be small, but at population levels will be huge. One of the main ones that people are concerned about is the cybersecurity of data. I think by entering your details into ChatGPT, if you're not using a commercially available API, you are giving them your data. Whatever you're typing in, they are storing and using for their training. And there've already been examples of, I think it was, I can't remember the company, but one company that had a lot of engineers using ChatGPT for free, and basically it was copying their code. So that's one thing about AI safety. The other that people are scared of, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, is the Skynet situation where AI breaks out of its housing and disseminates itself across the internet. I'm really not worried about that at this present moment in time. And I think to even engage in that conversation shows that you don't fully understand the current limitations and capabilities of AI. What's the other thing on AI safety I wanted to mention? Yes, it was about accuracy. We are at risk of overly anthropomorphizing and trusting AI because we're putting it through natural language. Just because it can write something in a language that you understand in a readable format doesn't mean it's trustworthy. And we need to develop better ways of scoring and ranking and rating AI generated content, especially the image-based stuff. It's getting to the point now where it's actually quite difficult to tell AI generated imagery from real imagery. And I think there's a massive safety issue in generated content that is developed by bad actors. So it's all fun and games while it's new because everyone's playing around with it. But we see time and time again, whenever a new technology becomes publicly available, the bad actors will use it first. And then everyone will take a big breath and go, oh, yeah, the people who are banging on about AI safety were probably right. We should have listened to them.
Absolutely. I think I saw Stuart Russell on Sam Harris. I heard Stuart Russell on Sam Harris's podcast, maybe an episode from March this year. But there was one other machine learning researcher on there, and they essentially said that at some point they might even need to like timestamp actual video just to show that it is of a legitimate original source and wasn't deep faked or artificial. It was legitimate. And I also think that I also heard that the EU had some legislation saying that you have a right to know if you're interacting with a human or a machine, which is a classic example of regulation. Just reining in this rapidly advancing technology beyond places where it is being used with questionable ethics, and putting in a hard stop, saying no, this is where we use these things that help us to do X, Y, and Z more effectively. This is how we make sure that it's done safely and effectively.
Absolutely right. Yeah, no, we should have that choice, and we have it in the medical device regulations as well. Is the patient has a choice of whether or not to have their decisions made by an automated machine or not. And I think that's super important. Again, the grandmother test, would you want that to be used on your grandmother without her knowledge or consent? And coming from the point of view of a good actor, you might think, well, obviously, this is obvious. But from a bad actor, it's like a get out of jail free card. If no one puts those rules in place, they can go out and do whatever they want. And as soon as someone starts generating content about you as a person that has a bad, outcome, then people will start to realize that actually this is entirely possible, and in fact too easy to do. And you could probably make more money from AI doing bad stuff than you can good stuff right now.
A big thank you to Dr. Harvey for taking his time to talk to us. You can find links to his work in the description. Thanks for listening, and catch you next time.